We have the panel, which is, I'm very, very much excited that now at Ukraine, here at where we are, with these Ukrainian panels in Davos, we're really speaking about the globe and have the speakers from all over the world, not just Europe and Ukraine and the US when we are speaking about the globe. And I'll start with a tiny anecdote, please allow me. This panel calls a world war Ukraine must win. I have a friend who has a friend who is a flamboyant Ukrainian lawyer. You would more often see in the parties, with a DJ. And he said that I would never imagine myself fighting as a soldier at war. That's what he said some years ago. And now he said, maybe I was mistaken. I actually could have imagined myself being a soldier. I couldn't have imagined myself be fighting on the Russian soil in Kursk, fighting against North Koreans. That I wouldn't ever imagine in my life, but that's our reality today, as what's something we couldn't imagine a year ago, that all my friends and my Syrian friends, I work with Syrian lawyers, would now be busy in Damascus. So I think there is a lot to start. And we have also, I'll introduce the panel and panelists later, but we have with us also the Deputy Chief Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, General Vadim Skibitsky, and he has a short presentation with the slides. That's exactly why we need first to see them, and then we'll get the speakers on the table. So, General, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Very briefly about the current situation and plans of Russian Federation according to Ukraine. It's very important before we start your panel for understanding what is the approach of Russian Federation today against Ukraine. Believe me, it's not a simple combat activity in the battlefield. At least our assessment, Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, 3 new ways concerning the pressure on Ukraine. First, it's pressure of force in the battlefield. Next one, destabilization situation in Ukraine. And third one, isolation of Ukraine in international community. Because without this approach, Russia cannot win the war. From the beginning, from the collapse of Soviet Union, the strategic goal of Russian Federation against Ukraine is the same. Full occupation, our territory, and full control of territory of Ukraine in economic, political, military, culture, and another sphere. And of course, destruction of Ukraine statehood and depriving the population of Ukraine. That is why you can see this activity on this way of Russian Federation in our territory. Our president yesterday said about the number of troops, land forces of Russian Federation in our territory. In this slide you can see the number of tanks, APC, BMP, artillery system. For example, launches of ballistic missiles, 52, including North Korean launches with ballistic missile KN-23 and KN-24. And of course, combat ships, submarines in Black Sea and the Azov Sea. The nearest future, the plans of Russian Federation full occupation Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast, and to hold the temporary occupied territories of our country, including Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea Peninsula. And of course, what is the next? What is the new approach of Russian Federation today, not only in Ukraine, in intelligence community in many countries in the world? You can see in the slide, it's not our assessment. It's plans of Russian Federation concerning the hybrid, so-called hybrid warfare. And when we say about the support to Russian Federation, of course, for example, foreign anti-Western alliance, North Korea, Iran, today, for example, Belarus, and another countries that support of Russian Federation, not only weapons, munition, but another components for the production of weapons, UAVs and another weapons and equipment in the territory of Russian Federation. And another way, including cyber attacks, including sabotage action and intelligence activity, for example, in Europe, concerning the support of European country to Ukraine. I think today we will have a very nice discussion concerning the further development situation, concerning the security situation not only in Europe, security situation and security environment in the world. Because today it's priority number one, security. Security in many spheres, including political, including economic sphere, including military, and security civilian people in many, many countries in the world. I wish you good discussion. And Natalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, General. Be ready to comment as well. And I invite our guest. I'll introduce them and then please take the seat in the first row. We don't want to have it empty. So I'll introduce Professor Timothy Snyder, who is a Richard C. Levin Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale University. Woosuk Choi, who is the first time at this type of panel with us, who is a deputy managing editor of the Chosun daily newspaper, the leading newspaper in South Korea, and is Director General of the Asian Leadership Conference. We have Phyllis O'Brien, who is a professor of strategic studies at St. Andrews University, and then Oğuz Katerci, who is Ukraine correspondent, but from the Polish company TVP. I'll start, and I think after this presentation, let's go still not about very theoretical things, but more clear, because we're looking so closely to what's happening in the participation of the North Korean troops. You know, it's a game changer, mainly not because of the number of the troops. It's really not a lot, but it's officially acknowledged that Russia included the troops from a foreign country. I would remember, Mr. Choi, when I had a chance to be in Seoul a year ago, and this year, it was a distant war. We understood very clearly why, for South Koreans, it's important to keep this war away. You know, too volatile, too far away. Ukraine was warning about the ballistic missiles, all that kind of things. Still, later we were telling, but them would be the troops. And what is most important, it's not a mere amount of this, a sheer amount of those troops, but the fact that they would learn the drone warfare, the tactics of the modern war, something the country like North Korea, without Russian support, won't be able. And this can be copied, can be used. So, and this happened. You know, that's something which we were giving a part of intelligence, but that has happened. We know that there is a political change in South Korea, there would be the elections, and you're so preoccupied by the local and domestic issues, which are serious, very important. But still, has the view changed in Seoul that, I don't know, not just that Ukraine must win, but there should be some actions and participation and the role of the countries who try not to provoke, stay away, but sometimes, as we know, you don't want to be involved, but nobody asks you.
Actually, well, thanks for having me here. My name is Ken Choi. I am a journalist for Korea. I've been in the journalism business for 33 years. I never imagined that one day a North Korean would enter a war in European theater. I just checked. The last time Asian was in the European theater was the Mongolians invading Hungary in 1241. So 900 years later, this happens again. And actually 3 years ago when the war broke out, I'm a journalist, but I also run the Asian Leadership Conference that I founded. And Mrs. Zelenska came in 2023 in person and President Zelensky participated online because when the war broke out from day one, I ran YouTubes and all these things condemning Russian aggression because from day one, we all knew that this was not a just war. It was unjust to invade an independent state, unjust to violate all the human rights. So we, put all these films together and ran it, and in order to educate the Korean public, because when the war broke out, just to tell you the truth, average Koreans, really, as Natalia said, it was a distance, far away thing. It has nothing to do with us. But instantly I knew that this is not just a war by Ukraine, because this is a war about freedom, about democracy. It's about someday it could hit us. It's just I had a hunch. So we ran all these YouTube things, and lo and behold, about 2 weeks later, YouTube suspended us because some Russians claimed that I just suspect it was Russians. The YouTube wouldn't tell who it was, but somebody claimed that all our footage were outdated. So we put all these outdated war films into put together and to sort of to denigrate the Russians, blah blah blah. So the YouTube put us on hold for 6 weeks, and we couldn't, have access to our account. So we complained, but nothing happened. And then only after 6 weeks, they let us run these things again. So after that, actually, we wrote extensively on our newspaper all these unjust wars and atrocities committed by these Russians. And to tell you the truth, the Korean government, even though it was a conservative president, they were very careful on, to going into the Ukrainian side, because they all know strategically Korea is still has a lot. Number one, has a lot of investment in Russia. Number two, because of the relationship with North Korea, the North Koreans could develop all these nuclear or missile technologies that could be directed to us. So, which Russians could provide. We knew that Russians were very stingy about providing new high technologies to North Korea, even to South Korea. So we were very skeptical, but still the South Korean government at the time was very careful on what to do. But the president, who's in trouble today, but 2 years ago, I sort of persuaded him that this is a war, not just confined to Ukraine, but someday it will come to us. So maybe we may not provide, lethal sort of military weapons to Ukraine, but we have to support Ukrainians one way or the other, because we were back in 1950, Korea was invaded by North Korea with the communist help of the Russians, and we only overcome because the UN came to help us, including the United States. And after 72 years, when the shots stopped in 1953, Korea is now the 10th largest economy in the world. I don't brag about what the situation is today in Korea, but still we sort of established a full democracy, free market economy. The living standard is pretty high up there. So I think, we could provide something to the Ukrainians that this is what we did, maybe you can do better, and try to give encouragement to the Ukrainians. And actually 2 years ago, when my president was here in Davos, I was able to help the Deputy Minister of Ukraine economy to introduce him to all our Korean ministers and the president himself. And the president, I was standing right next to him. The president held the hands of the deputy minister and told him that, hold on, hang on, you will win, and we will try to help you out because you're not alone. If whatever there is, we will try to coordinate some support. So just hang tough. And then I brought him to the First Lady of Korea. She's in trouble now too, but I told that day, I don't know if you remember, but a helicopter crashed into a kindergarten, killing your Minister of Interior. So the Deputy Prime Minister was supposed to come to Korea, and she couldn't come because of that incident. So I told our First Lady about this incident in front of the Deputy Minister of Economy. And the first word she said was, so pitiful that these children had to die because of this war. So hang on, Korea, sympathetically. I mean, in terms of like hearts and souls and minds or whatever, we'll try to help you. So this is the attitude of the conservative government in Korea. Lo and behold, the progressive government, for some reason, they're pro-China, pro-North Korea, whatever, and they kept on saying, "Why do you help Ukraine?" This is, and just to be honest, half of Korea is supporting Ukraine, half of Korea is still, very whimsical, and they're still trying to steer away from, war that's 10,000 miles away. So, to answer your question, yes, good heart for 26 million people are really trying to help Ukraine. The other half are very whimsical. They are not decided what to do. They still, don't want to do anything with the war, blah, blah, blah. So, and the next, I don't know if there's an election coming up, but if there's an election in June or whatever, a new president's in, if the conservative wins again, I think the assistance to Ukraine will continue. If not, then you will fizzle out.
Will work. Then we'll work.
Yeah.
Professor Snyder, I have a more broader question, because I always like to speak the panel up to the title. So there is something from the title into that. Of course, but I cannot tell it without acknowledging that, yes, despite, we mentioned in the beginning, the change with North Korea, the change in Damascus, we have the change, politically in the US. We're all discussing that. And a year ago, that was one thing. We were waiting in anxiety, what would happen, but that's today's reality. And there is a lot of, and Ukrainians, including Europeans, try to engage with the new administration. Since this week it's a new administration. And we have to speak to the people we maybe disagreed a year ago and disagreed 2 months ago, but we need to talk because we are dependent. So we cannot afford just have this, at least us, we cannot afford to fight or attack. If, for instance, you'd have a chance to speak reasonably, not just about why, it's in the interest of the US for Ukraine to win, but in the interest of the world, what would you say to the people who disagree with you? Because it's easy to speak to the people who agree. What would be your address to those people? Rational, maybe irrational, wherever. We try always, all the ways.
Okay, can I warm up with the arguments for people who agree with me, and then try to move on to answer your question, which is a legitimately difficult one. So I want to take a step back and just make the case in a non-political way.
Okay.
Whether you're right or left, whether you're Korean or Argentinian, whether you're Asian or European, I think there's some aspects of this war which speak to the very fundamental concerns of this conference. This conference is meant to be about the future, and yet every year it's more and more about the present, right? It's always meant to have an inspiring vision for the future, and yet as things get worse and worse, it's more and more about what's right in front of us. And I want to suggest that the war in Ukraine, and again, these are arguments that I believe should appeal to all people, at least of goodwill. The war in Ukraine is about characterizing the future in a very fundamental way, or several fundamental ways. One has to do with whether we're going to have the ability to communicate with each other on the basis of things that are true. This is apart from anything else, a war that's based on lies and the ability to lie. And we've seen how lying has been very hard on democracy. I'm going to suggest that lying is going to be very hard on capitalism next. You can't push disinformation and exploitation to an infinite limit without all of these things we count on having trouble. The second way it's fundamentally about the character of the world, I think, is oligarchy. The invasion of Ukraine is an example of what happens when too much money and too much power are in the hands of one person. Then, to pick up this word whimsical, then on the basis of whimsy, on the basis of one man's ideas, you can have these incredibly unwise wars. And whether the world turns towards oligarchy or not is something which is very much in play. And a third is the world of rules, right? So if and when people, when Europeans say a rule-based order, everybody immediately falls off their chairs and goes to sleep. But the Europeans are right about a rules-based order, because the opposite of a rules-based order is an order in which everybody can invade everybody all the time on the basis of spurious arguments. And we've seen that world before. For a historian, it's really hard to watch as like the memory of the Second World War recedes and suddenly everyone thinks it's a free-for-all and it's okay to talk about invading other countries. And another way, the final way this war is fundamentally, I'm trying not to talk directly about Ukraine, but about the world is whether we're going to have hydrocarbon wars and resource wars. I personally think that this war does have to do with Putin's own fascist ideology, but I think that ideology works very well with the notion of conquering other people's territory and stripping them of their resources, which of course fascism was also always all about. In 30 years, we're not going to make it as a species if the way we decide to deal with the way we decide to deal with climate is everybody seizing everybody else's hydrocarbons. Okay, so those were the arguments for people of goodwill. I will now try to answer the more narrow political question. And I have to say, I can't do this, as you're well aware, Natalia, from the inside. But I will make a few observations. One is that if you're dealing with the Trump administration, the hardest position to be in is that of a friend. You don't want to be America's friend right now, because America's the first take of Trump administration foreign policy is to make things hard on your friends. That's the first take. That's the first thing they're doing. Our very best friends, arguably Denmark and Canada, if they're not our very best friends, they're very close to the top. And our first move is to make things hard for them. So in that sense, there's an opening for Ukraine because, Trump does not see Ukraine as a very close American friend. I think he has undefined views about Ukraine. He's not going to want to make things hard for Ukraine on purpose. The second thing which is really important is the issue of strength. So Trump 1 was in some sense an accidental president. He didn't realize he was going to be in power. A lot of it was made up along the way. Trump 2 is not an accidental president, and Trump 2 is characterizing himself, defining himself as a strong man, which isn't going to be wonderful for those of us who are citizens of the United States, but it does provide a language for talking about how the war can end. The war can't end by weakening the weaker side. The war can only end by strengthening the weaker side. And so if Trump, I can't say whether this is true, but if Trump this time around is not going to be bullied by Putin, the obvious way for him not to be bullied by Putin is to help Ukraine. Like that would be the thing which shows that there is actually an America first foreign policy, as opposed to just the words existing. So related to this is how one appeals to this administration. There are transactional things which Ukrainians can do very well by themselves, but then there's also this question of prestige. If Trump really wants to have this kind of image, he also has to have some kind of reality. And the negative version of this is Afghanistan. So the Trump administration, having made Afghanistan, those people made Afghanistan the nightmare of the Biden presidency. They're well aware that Ukraine could be the nightmare of their presidency. And that's the negative way to pick this up. And I think these arguments about how if you lose Ukraine, you lose other things can be made in a different way for the Trump people. The way you make it to the Trump people is, if you lose Ukraine, no one takes you seriously ever again, my friend, on any other matter.
Thank you, Professor. And I'll go to Scattergy, who is working for the Polish TVP, but of the Lebanese British origin. You report the war against Ukraine from the ground, but of course you can't be indifferent of what's happening in Damascus. And how do you see that can, change our war, but also the outcome of the war? Because, a common sense is Putin is not invincible. Dictators are not invincible. That's the first. The regimes we were in power for 50 years are not invincible. That's the first takeaway, but maybe you would elaborate.
Sure. I mean, the first thing I'll say is that the war in Syria, the Syrian civil war, and the war in Ukraine are heavily interconnected with each other. These are not events that have no correspondence with each other. It's not just the fact that Russia intervened. That was part of Russia's power projection to the rest of the world. And really losing Syria is a big blow to Putin's self-image, to the image that he wanted to project of Russia being a great power. This was Russia intervening in the Middle East to protect a dictator from his own people. And that project, after 13 years, has finally collapsed. And now Russia is evacuating Hmeimim Air Base and the port of Tartus. One would argue that Vladimir Putin intervened in Syria to maintain a foothold in the Mediterranean. And he now seems to have lost that. HTS may decide that they want to negotiate with Russia on that, although that is not something I would advise to the Syrian people, given the way Russia has treated them and treated anyone who is within their sphere of influence or outside of their sphere of influence. So I'm probably an interesting person to have on here because I'm probably one of the few journalists in the world who's reported from Idlib when it was held by HTS and from the Kursk region of Russia. I've only visited Russia once in my life and I don't have a stamp in my passport. It does show that Russia is not invincible. And Russian invincibility was the theme of the last decade. Ukraine punctured this image, and by shooting down the war criminals that bombed hospitals and schools in Syria, Ukrainians have brought justice forward in this world in a way that I couldn't have imagined would have happened 10 years ago. So yeah, the war in Syria, the reason Syria has been liberated and its dictatorship is now living in exile in, guess where, Moscow, is that the Ukrainians fought the Russians to a relative stalemate in Ukraine. Particularly the Russian Air Force, which, Russia didn't really deploy many ground troops in Syria. It was really, they were marshalling the forces in coordination with Iran and using their Air Force to devastating effect. Now, using their Air Force to devastating effect, not against Syrian rebels, but against Syrian children, Syrian hospitals, Syrian bread lines, farms, anything that's provided sustenance for the Syrian people, that's what the Russians targeted first. And I was in Kyiv 10 days before the war broke out in February 2022. And I went there because from the signs, I expected a massive war, an invasion, not just an invasion of Donetsk and Luhansk, but an invasion of Kyiv. And this took a lot of people by surprise, but it didn't take me by surprise because, one, I was familiar with how Russia conducted itself in a war, and two, I was using open source information to track Russian troop movements on the border. There was no reason why Russians would be in Belarus in huge numbers if they were... there was no reason unless they were going for Kyiv. So that was very much something that I was aware of and warning. One of the things I did within the first days of the war is published a series of tweets warning the Ukrainians of how they dealt with the United Nations. I warned them not to give the locations of field clinics, not to give the locations of hospitals, not to give the locations of bread lines, World Food Programme deliveries, because in Syria, Russia accessed that information directly from the United Nations and then bombed them. They negotiated an aid convoy to get into Aleppo, and in front of the eyes of the world, the aid convoy, the Red Cross aid convoy, UN aid convoy, that they negotiated entry for, they bombed it in front of the eyes of the world. They had it on Russia Today, they had the drone following it, they cut the drone off and they bombed it for hours. This is what you're dealing with. You're dealing with a country state. I hesitate to call it a country. John McCain, I believe, said it best. It's a gas station with nukes. That's what it is. The Russian dictatorship does not respect human rights. It doesn't believe in human rights. It doesn't respect international law. It doesn't believe in international law. We really are moving back into the era of great power conflict, and what we understood as the liberal world order, post-war order, that's gone. It's not that collapsing or it's gone now. The very first moment in 2014 that Russia invaded Ukraine, that's the moment it went. And us in the West, and I want to be critical of the Biden administration here, have failed to understand the challenge put towards them. I'm obviously an outspoken critic of President Trump as well. I do think it's both remarkable and a tragedy, the way the messaging has pivoted from a war of democracy, of values, to a war of transactional nature. We can help you by giving you our resources. We can help you because it's in your best interest to help us. I think the fact that we've had to move into this space is in and of itself a tragedy, because this is a war for democracy, it is a war for those values. And right now we are suffering because we have not recognized the threat posed by Russia, and we're still acting as if we're dealing with a Russia that respects international norms, where they use chemical weapons on British soil, radiological weapons on British soil. They supported the chemical weapons use in Syria. This is what we're dealing with here, and this is what we're going to continue to deal with unless we take it seriously.
I had a chance to be in the panel here yesterday with the American colleagues and pundits, and also while talking a lot, there are a lot of discussions that, there is the audience globally, the electorate in a lot of countries who don't want to step into the World War III. But for me as a Ukrainian, you kind of, but isn't it already somehow there, but it just fought by the Ukrainians? Professor Brian, you are a historian, you're a professor of strategic studies, but you're a historian of wars. So how you describe that, and also your books were about how the wars were won. Mm-hmm. So if Ukraine is already part of this global war, the world war, what is the lessons to learn it for everybody's benefit, or at least for the benefit of the good and the rules, let's say like that, not for everybody's?
Wow. Well, in terms of how wars are won, what's been interesting to me is how we still don't know how wars are won, or people don't understand the process. And certainly, I would argue the American and European debate is based on an absolutely flawed understanding of war. And this, I'm not trying to say this because I knew, but I was saying in January 2022, Russia's overrated. Ukrainians are going to fight. This war is going to last a long time. It's going to go off the rails. Anyone who thinks this will end in a week just doesn't know war. War does not work like that. But yet there was this extraordinary consensus, and this goes up to the top of the U.S. military. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs told Congress Kyiv would fall in 3 days. So there is a fundamental misunderstanding of the process of war. Now, but if you want to read more, Elliot Cohen and I published a report through CSIS with a really brilliant introduction by Hugh Strawn, where we started to try and take these issues apart. But the problem we have is that kind of thinking about war certainly did not penetrate the Biden administration's and European aid policy to this time. It's been sort of focused on a very narrow idea of a battlefield. So, and this is because of this notion that you could control war. If there's something that drove me most crazy about the Biden administration's policy, it's that somehow, I called it the Goldilocks strategy, that you could sort of micromanage the war depending on what you gave Ukraine. And if you gave them things they could fire 30 miles, well, that would be okay. And then that would keep it from exploding. And all that's done is lengthened the war and made it more grotesque. We have created this war. We've made it worse than it ever had to be because we don't understand wars and we think we can control them. Either you do what Russia is trying to do now, which is to fight to win. Russia is taking everything it can from wherever it can get it. North Korean troops, Iranian shaheeds. It's taking whatever it can. because it wants to win the war. Whereas still, Ukraine's backers in Europe and the United States, I don't think want Ukraine to win the war. They want Ukraine to survive. They want Ukraine to hold on to most of its territory, but they don't want Ukraine to win. And I think that has to fundamentally change if anything is going to work. And that means that they have to allow Ukraine and provide Ukraine with the support to fight the kind of war, by the way, the United States would fight. The great fraud of all of this is Ukraine has been forced to fight a war that NATO would never fight. The last thing NATO would be doing is fighting a trench warfare. It's inconceivable that the United States or NATO states would do that. So, I mean, I would say, starting from that point of view, that what this has been is a strategic disaster, but it's been a created strategic disaster. The problem that it has, it is convinced or convinced certain people that part of the Russian narrative is right. The slide that was put up on Russian information hybrid warfare, it missed out one thing, and the one thing is the slide that Russia has been very good at is convincing certain people that Russia can't lose. That actually matters more, I would say, than undermining the view of the West and the global South, is the absolute importance of combating the Russian narrative that Russia is a great power that cannot lose in Ukraine. It cannot lose because it's going to nuke the world, or it cannot lose because it's going to throw millions of people at something and therefore cannot lose. That is the thing that needs to be combated more than anything else. That's a political question. People think populations turn against war because they're horrible. Populations turn against war because they don't think they can be won. This is where people actually don't mind other people dying, I'm sorry to say. They actually rationalize it. They don't like to die themselves, but if they're not the ones dying and other people are dying, they're actually okay with it. When they turn against a war, it's the moment they believe that war cannot be won. And this has been the great problem with the strategy. So I would say, in a nutshell, those are the things that really have to change.
I would have a couple of questions, but I also would ask a bit later, maybe General Skibitsky also a bit add up on the third parties participating in aiding Russia in what is happening, so you will give a bit more upgrade on that. But I would return to Kenneth, because you really explained why it's very important and why there is Koreans who are supporting Ukraine. But making it a bit more global, because it's just a case for South Korea. At a lot of panels here, this year, we're learning from the Ukrainian military on how developed Ukrainian army is today, how we are way ahead of a lot of people in the drone warfare, in other technology, in medical technology on the ground. There are, the panels, like for the second day, this is a second dominating theme. So it's clear that disregarding what is the political situation in Seoul, yes, the soldiers in the north would learn. The others are also learning, and disregarding what you provide to Ukraine, whether you help or not, you need to be vigilant and learn. And there was a question on the panel, are NATO generals learning from the Ukrainians? So is this at least eagerness? If there is no idea to get involved, to help, to support, the idea that indeed, the doctrine is changing. You need to learn, apply it, to see it. Is that thinking anywhere in the region? What is your feeling from talking to a lot of people in your region?
Well, actually, Ukraine is one of the 6 countries in the world that can manufacture fighter jet engine. So in that terms, I don't know whether you knew, but it's fact. And that capability means a lot, because the country itself is not like, some Bundak country, whatever. It has a very specific high-tech industry in Ukraine. And, Korea is also interested in those technologies, but because of the warfare that's actually, undertaken so far, the South Korean military is keenly aware and interested in what's happening in Ukraine, and North Koreans' participation That's why it's alarming, because they may use the same technologies that they learned fighting. I mean, out of 10,000, they lost 3,000 so far. And North Koreans, as was said, they don't care about the human rights, so they will deploy another 20,000, only killing another 10,000. But if they can learn the technologies of the warfare, they might redeploy that to the Korean peninsula. That's what really frightening the good number of Korean in the military. So yes, we are keenly aware there's good parts in the society that's very interested in what's happening in the European theater, Ukrainian theater. And let me elaborate a little bit more. We talk about the warfare and all these things, and the world helping Ukraine and whatever. Let me just throw you a practical thing. When 2 years ago, when Mrs. Zelensky came to Korea, and Mr. President, you were in the Asian Leadership Conference as well. Lo and behold, Korea and Ukraine didn't even have a general agreement. General agreement meaning both countries respect each other's citizens, wealth and all these things. We couldn't even wire the money to Ukraine, period. So this is a practical thing that Ukrainians have not really looked into. Koreans really didn't care. So it took me about a year to pound on the Ministry of Finance, pound on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to get these things ratified. It took almost a year since Mrs. Zelensky's visit to Korea. Now the two countries have this agreement. Now Korea can provide, EDCF, all these things, and wire the money and so on. But I bet you Ukraine does not have these general agreements with many other countries. And I think this is a practical matter. You need to have these infrastructure, economic infrastructure ready with all 190 countries in the world in order to not only trade, but get help and all these things. And when the moment comes, I think that infrastructure will help you to turn around the table in a war against Russia. Korea can send money to Russia, but we couldn't send money to Ukraine. That really flabbergasted me 2 years ago. So I think this is a more practical advice to the Ukrainians. You talk about all these warfare, all these things, but on the other side, you have to look into these practical economic things, to get the things ready when time comes, right?
General, would you add on to the, you started with a presentation on Professor Brian, I'm asking for the mic, said that, Russia gets what they need in order to win. So what this Russia gets in order to win? And is it doable to challenge at this stage? Are we capable to stop it? And how?
Russia understands that some problem for Russia in this war in second half of 2022 concerning the UAVs, concerning the munition, concerning another kind of type of weapons. And after that, we saw the next step of Russia concerning the agreement with North Korea, agreement with Iran. And for example, from June of 2023, Russian Federation received from North Korea at least 4 million shells caliber of 152, 122, and plus ballistic missiles today, plus artillery system, mortars, and so. What is the next step? I think Russia will develop this relations with another countries, and of course, in bilateral interest, because Russia received munition, equipment, weapons, and that this country received another kind of products, technology, radars, some modern equipment, and so. And one of the purpose for our activity to stop this cooperation. Why? Because it's threat not only for Ukraine, it's threat for many countries in the world.
Oz mentioned that he kind of disappointed with the reason that it's not any longer about the values, very transactional. Can we, those who do care about the values and human rights, use our brain to speak that language, transactional language, and enforce rights and values into the transaction, so we can, persuade the people who don't maybe are not any longer listening that Ukraine needs to win for the rules, for the values, for the democracy. Yes, that's to you.
I mean, I think Ukrainians. I want to follow up on something that Philip said actually about learning, because it leads into this question. The people who have learned the most from Ukrainians, sadly, are the Russians. Ukrainians have been innovating all the way through, and unfortunately, with a small delay, the Russians then copy everything they can. So the Ukrainians have been innovating all the way through. Partly they have to innovate because we don't give them the things we should have given them, and the Russians copy. So whether or not we learn, the Russians are learning, and one has to think realistically about the outcome of the war. If you allow Russia to win, and I agree very much with the way Phillips O'Brien phrased this, we have not treated ourselves as an agent in this war. We treated ourselves as a spectator or a game player, and in the game we've been playing for a tie. If you take agency of this, you realize, well, if we let Russia win this war, then they gain not only experience from fighting Ukraine, they gain Ukrainian experience directly. There's a loss here, right? A direct loss. There's a big question about who gains the resources, not just intellectual, but technological, that Ukraine has developed during this war. Is it South Korea and Taiwan and the United States? Or is it North Korea, Russia, and Belarus? And that, I think, is a very strong, I don't think the word transactional applies, I think it's actually a very strong strategic argument. If you think you're in a world of great powers, whether or not you believe in human rights and rules, if you think you're in a world of great powers, it's just strategically idiotic to allow the fruits of the major war of the century to fall in the lap of your rivals. And it's idiotic whether you're the Biden administration or the Trump administration. Whether you're thinking in terms of rules or thinking in terms of rivals, it's just phenomenally foolish to think this great war, that this largest war since 1945 can be fought without affecting your strength one way or the other. So with trying to make the argument in terms of values, like everybody values something, and some people value being an important country. Some people value being first, and you can speak to that by saying, if you lose here, not just that you look like a loser, but you actually lose assets, where you can push yourself to the point where America first is a little bit silly, because you're not only losing wars, but you're losing the things that go along with wars. And of course, trying to finish on a slightly more positive note, freedom is still nevertheless a word that you can use across a very broad swath of the American populace. And I'm also going to note that supporting Ukraine is still a fairly popular thing in American society. And you can still speak to Americans, and to some extent their elected representatives, with the language of values, even if the administration seems to be in a much more transactional great power mode.
Oz, and if you follow the what's happening in the region, some analysts to whom I speak say it looks like the Russia was ready to give up a bit on the Iran, with its, let's say, withdrawal from Syria. What is your take on that? Where it's all heading? What do you think would be the role of the Russia in the region? It's not like it's just stepping out. I'm suspicious. I'm really suspicious. If you don't hear about somebody like that for some time, you just think what they are, cooking.
So the Russians are trying now to fully pivot towards Libya. And look, the reason the Mediterranean is important for them is their operations in Africa. This is a resource grab for them. They had Wagner, PMC doing all sorts of activities. A dictatorship protection service is what Russia has offered. Military intervention on behalf of despots, tyrants, in order to try and prop up their regimes in exchange for natural resources. We're living in an incredibly dangerous world, and Russia has no intention of withdrawing from these areas. They have to be pushed out. And the idea, if you'd have told people 5-6 years ago, I think what you said is very important, the idea that Russia likes to tell people it can't be defeated. The argument, from my country at least, that we couldn't get involved in Syria, that we should do nothing when the Assad regime and Russia were bombing hospitals, is that, well, we can't get involved because if we do, it's a world war with Russia. Russia will use nuclear weapons. Russia was not going to go to war with the world over Bashar al-Assad. And the moment they were forced into being forced into reassessing their position in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, they withdrew. They were losing, and they cut their losses, and they walked away. And not supporting Ukraine to the degree that Ukraine deserves to be supported is only empowering the Russians. We empowered the Russians when they invaded Crimea, and all we did was slap some sanctions on them. Today, we're still arguing about sanctioning Russian banks. Whatever idea we have about sanctions, we need to upgrade our thinking. North Korea, Iran, and Russia are, apart from Cuba and Venezuela, the most heavily sanctioned countries on the planet. And rather than trying to pivot back to a world in which they're not state sponsors of terrorism and war criminals, they've decided to get together and share their resources, share their technological approaches, share all these things to try and defeat the West. This is not... Russia doesn't see itself at war with Ukrainian soldiers. It sees itself at war with the wider world, with the West, the international community, NATO. And until we realize that they are at war with us, whether we want to be at war with them or not, more Ukrainian soldiers are going to die in the service of protecting our freedoms in Europe. And this is why I'm so appalled by the direction that we've been heading in, because we have to step up to protect Ukrainians, to help Ukrainians win this war, because it's a war that involves all of us. And whether we don't see it or not, the Russians do. And that's the important thing. The Russians see themselves at war with us, and until we realize that, we're going to stay on the losing side.
I want to involve everybody in my kind of last question, but I'll give the chance before. It's the same question I'll have to Professor Brian, but I'll also give you a chance after to ask your questions. Like there is an elephant in the room. We're here this year, and I know what are the behind stage questions, kind of the real questions. They are all about the talks. They are all about possible settlement, kind of all this discussion considered for the panel, but there is a real one. That's, how I do feel, and we know it, let's be honest about that. So, Phillips, what would be your take, how to deal with that? Sure. We can't be on the denial that that's the talk. That's not exactly, this narrative is there.
Yeah, I think we have a pretty good idea of what the Trump administration is going to do, actually. They've not been terribly hidden about it. What they're going to call for at some point. And by the way, the one thing that has really changed positively for Ukraine in Trump's mind is that Trump has understood now Russia is weak. I don't think people have paid enough attention to that. He said it the last 2 nights. And if you go back to February 2022, look what Trump is saying. Putin is a genius, a mastermind for this invasion. So he bought entirely the strong Russian narrative. It was sort of the formative view of how his view of Europe was, that Russia was strong and Europe was a bunch of weak hippies. What has changed is he now understands Russia is much weaker than he thought. And if you look at what he says the last night, that's there. So that is the one thing. He's now actually going to go into this situation with no starry-eyed view of what Putin's strength is. I think that's the good thing. The bad thing is you have to understand what's off the table is NATO. It's not on the table. All right? This is not going to be done. That the most pro-Ukraine people around Trump, such as General Kellogg, have talked about a 20-year ban on Ukraine joining NATO. That's the most pro-Ukraine people. So you have to look for security guarantees that will not involve NATO, and that will have to be Europe. The only real security guarantees that will be open to Ukraine will be through membership of the European Union, and then relationships with European militaries through that. That has to be what the foundation of the peace. What Trump will want to do, I think very clearly, is freeze the line where it is. That's it. Freeze the line, use the threat of American aid to make Ukraine agree to that, and use the threat of American aid to Ukraine to make Russia agree to that too. okay? So that US aid is going to be a threat to both countries. Ukraine, if you don't agree to the frozen line, you get no aid. Russia, if you don't agree to the frozen line, we're going to give, in a ceasefire, we're going to give Ukraine a lot. So that's sort of what is coming down the pike. Frozen conflict, no NATO. So what Ukraine will have to do is establish through Europe its own security guarantees. And that will be absolutely crucial in what is going on. So I don't think it's actually a lot of mystery that the world we are facing. The question Ukraine, and through that Europe will have to face really, is that a peace they want? That actually is one that they will face, and Ukraine will face in European states when it comes along. But we have to face that's I think what we're looking at.
Oh, do you have the questions? If you do, so please raise the hand. Yes, and then I'll have you have a final thoughts.
So I'm part of a coalition, Catherine, of lawyers, economists, journalists, and professionals that are looking to unlock $100 billion in the next 30 to 60 days of the frozen assets. The big game changer is they are no longer in securities, they are in cash, which means that the jurisdiction has changed, which means Europe doesn't hold them all. 45% are now. So we're talking about a coalition of the willing, US, Canada, UK, and France that could do this rapidly. What kind of a game changer would it be if $100 billion was put into, let's say, a fund managed by Bank of England, like Iran? They did with Iran. What kind of game changer would that be to get that deal, a better deal on the table for Ukraine?
Is anybody ready to take? Yes.
I'll go. I don't think it's a game changer at all. I mean, we had 80 billion worth of US aid. Not all of it was delivered, but that was the 2024 aid delivered to Ukraine. I think it's more of a threat to Russian interests than it is actually going to have any impact on the war itself. I think Ukraine needs much more money. It needs all of the 350 billion, whatever the actual number is. Again, what we're talking about is making Russia pay for the decisions that it's made, and that's the most important element of it. So I don't think it's going to be a game changer for, I don't think it's going to be a game changer for the war. But again, we're moving now into a bit of an uncertain time where the Americans are going to try and force this frozen conflict upon Ukraine. I think the biggest strategic thing that we can do is the Russians don't respect agreements. They've broken and violated every single one they've ever signed. So anything that's agreed with Russia will only be violated, and Ukraine will be invaded again. That's Russia's aims. So a ceasefire on frozen lines effectively gives them de facto control over these territories and effectively allows them to rebuild their strength. These initiatives will prevent Russia from being able to rebuild its strength and help Ukraine rebuild faster. I think we'll be able to pressure in a way that, again, I wouldn't use the word game changer. Pressure is probably a better way. Russia needs to pay.
Speaking, you mentioned, Professor Brian, the freeze, but if you really look historically, the 38th parallel, it was not the freeze because the sides decided to, it's time, it's too exhausting, we lost so many soldiers, it would be better for everybody. In March 1953, Stalin died. And then in 3 months, this ceasefire, armistice, was kind of possible. But there was an objective reason for that, not just, there was a moment. Having you, we so often are referring to this example of the freeze as something positive, because indeed, you started how successful South Korea is today I believe, on expense of all those millions lives lost in the north. What would be your take, and what is with you when you hear all the ideas about the freeze as a, successful example of that, and, that armistice?
Well, actually, during the Korean War, It was already, the current line was already set around 1952 sometime. So it went on for another year when they were talking about armistice. So I think, when we first heard about like freezing the current border thing, most Koreans, because of the experience, this is gonna go on for another, year or so. And I was just actually in DC for the Trump inauguration to cover some stories. And I talked to some Trump people, and they acknowledged that it's not going to be over soon. So because Trump said he will end the war immediately, like after he inaugurates, they were already spitting it out, like maybe first half of the year. And I bet you it's going to go on for till the end of the year before the winter comes. So I know, I'm just throwing this, negative things on to you. But my take is that don't bet on it. And you have to fight till the end. When the war is over, it's not going to be over till, just because Trump said this and Putin said that. So until you have to gain another inch or another mile, whatever, in the region, then this negotiation will take place. And as Professor Phillips said, the Russians, I don't know what Trump has in his mind, but the Trump people, they see, a good number of them are business people, and they see that Ukrainian reconstruction would be a big deal for these people, even though they don't say it right now. So I think it's in their interest to get this war done. But again, the war is not going to be over until it's really over. So don't get your hopes too high. Be realistic, and try to get an inch, 2 inch, whatever, as much as possible.
When you compare the Biden administration, the Trump administration, the kind of critique that you want to level has to be different, because these are very different milieu and very different kinds of Americans. So the Biden administration was very good at knowing how the American federal government worked, and they were very good at doing the things they said they were going to do. They were very bad at actually doing the things they ought to have done. I mean, here I agree with the left side of the room. They thought about it the wrong way, they conceived of it the wrong way, but when they needed to research and implement a policy proposal, they were 100% capable of doing that. The Trump administration is not going to be like that. They may pivot towards a much more aggressive language about Ukraine. They may even talk about winning. They may try to intimidate Putin. But their weakness is going to be that they've never cared about policy instruments. Right? Their view of policy is Biden did something and I can sign a piece of paper and undo it. Right? Their view of policy is the federal government has 40,000 civil servants, we can fire them. Right? Their view of policy is essentially a negative one. And what I'm trying to suggest is a positive thing. If you're dealing with the Trump administration and things go along the lines that Phillips and others are suggesting, Trump is going to have to be able to exert pressure on Putin in a way which is not just rhetorical. And he doesn't know how. And that's a way where allies and friends and Ukrainians could be helpful, because you've just had 4 years of thinking about policy instruments, which perhaps the Biden administration didn't use, but the Trump people don't necessarily know about. So that's just a word to the wise.
Jalskibis, you've given us a few warnings about the world, but would you also respond into the, so I think that should be the mic, you have it, or you will be given the mic, respond to all those also ideas, because there is a lot of talks about how there should be the settlement, because it will be better. Would it be, how we can use that and how to deal? What is your answer?
I think my answer is answer of NATO alliance concerning the increasing the funds, increasing the production of weapons and military products, increasing the security, not only in the battlefield, in the conventional weapons. Because today, when I say about the hybrid approach, it's one of the problems concerning, for example, cyber attacks, new IT technologies, some influence on some people, on some parties in the countries. Of course, today it's not easy to prevent such activity. Only in joint and common work together concerning some specific elements of activity of Russian Federation. And of course, for me, it's good that many countries in the world, not only in Europe, not only the neighboring countries of Russia, understand the capability of Russia and its allies to work together against democracy, against civil society in many countries, including Africa, for example.
This is a question. I want to have one technical note. There are some security protocol in the building for the next 10 minutes. So we were given a present of 10 minutes more. Actually, it's a privilege for this panel, so we can use them wisely instead of queuing downstairs for no reason. And Svetlana, please, the mic to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Svetlana Zalishuk. I'm a Ukrainian politician, and I have a question about NATO. So, when Berlin Wall fell, there was a discussion whether GDR can join NATO. And of course, Soviet Union in the very beginning of those talks was against that. But in the end, the international community, and in particular US, who was leading those negotiations, managed to persuade the Soviets that GDR not only can use NATO, but actually should join NATO, but should join NATO, because it would be in the interest of Soviet Union or Russia itself. And the argument behind that was that if GDR does not join NATO, then, for example, can develop a nuclear weapon as a deterrence security guarantee for themselves as an independent state in a turbulent world. And that was one of the arguments that convinced Soviets to give the green light for the GDR to join NATO at that point. And my question is, we've heard from the new US administration that in this war, it's both Ukraine and Russia has to make concessions in order to have a sustainable peace on the European continent. But wouldn't it be also true that US has to make a concession in terms of their own opinions or thinking about NATO issue? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give a very quick response to that. The issue with Ukraine and NATO is not that Russia doesn't want it. It is that right now, bipartisanly in the United States, neither party wants it. Biden didn't want it. Trump doesn't want it. And they're not going to... I mean, I want it. Believe me, I want it more than anything.
But because they accepted it as a legitimate concern of Russia, not because by per se they don't want to join NATO.
With no mic, it's not seen.
Again, if I would say a general thing, too much of this argument is done on natural justice. Ultimately, this is a political question in the U.S., and whereas Ukraine matters a great deal to us and everyone in this room, it doesn't matter to the degree that we would like it to matter within U.S. politics. Trump, by the way, Trump doesn't like NATO. It's not that he doesn't like Ukraine and NATO. He actually doesn't like NATO himself. He views NATO as a burden on the United States that, in fact, if he had his own way, he might pull the United States out of it. I just think to have the argument and try to push Ukraine to get into NATO, while I'd like to do that, is not going to happen right now. So I would really go with a European security solution, which might happen, and then hope US politics change in the future to allow Ukrainian membership. I mean, right now, by the way, Germany's against it too. I just don't think the membership of Ukraine in NATO right now is not going to happen.
I mean,
Tim.
Yeah, I agree with Phillips. Like, personally, I think it's the best solution in the interest of the United States, but that argument is not going to win. And so it's. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm going to keep making it. Yeah. I made it under the Biden people. I'll keep making it, but it's not going to win in the short term. So I want to spin one thing off your question and then say something new. one power political point that ought to be made more, which is also a values point, is that a world full of nuclear weapons is a bad world. And the Ukrainians are deterring nuclear proliferation by resisting this conventional war. The logic is that if you're able to defeat a conventional attack by a nuclear power with conventional weapons, then the world looks and says, all right, we don't all need nuclear weapons. If Ukraine is allowed to lose the war or is seen as losing the war, there are a bunch of mid-sized powers, some of them in the West, some of them not in the West, who are then planning, I think that's the right word to use at this point, to build a nuclear arsenal of their own. If you're the United States, that is actually not something that you want to have happen. And if you're China, you don't have it happen either, right? So there's a power political argument there about making sure that Ukraine is seen to win the war, which I'm pretty sure would be a new argument for a lot of the folks in the new administration, but which is worth thinking about. On NATO and ceasefires, I just want to inject the word sovereignty. If the United States says Ukraine can't join NATO, we do have to be very clear that that's because that's our political choice and not because Ukraine is not a sovereign country that can't join alliances on its own. And it's very important that any kind of ceasefire, truce, treaty, whatever, not have limits on the Ukrainian armed forces or which armed forces can be in Ukraine and things like that. I think those start to be lines where the sovereignty of the country is then being undermined, which of course was the original Russian war goal in the first place.
Not in order to break the discussion and not to let you feel the hostage, because I know a bit more, but in the presence of the Ukrainian general, I wouldn't say what I know. But we still need to wait for a couple of minutes, and you'll see nothing, even if you go out. So there is nothing to be anxious to see, but it's just security things. The only thing you can see is the security guards. So we are pleased to just go on conversation for a couple more minutes. And I don't mind, unless I said, like, as I said, I'm breaking it. So I think I want to finalize. Are we still speaking about the victory rather than sustainable peace, as we started, as a just peace, in case of Ukraine? And does it matter how it's named? What words we are using?
Yeah, it matters a lot. I mean, first of all, it's up to, I'm looking at the panel and you're the only Ukrainian on it, and it's up to the Ukrainians to decide what a victory is and what peace means. That's going to be their decision, and it's going to be a hard decision. As Phillips has constantly emphasized, there are some real factors here which people of goodwill can't necessarily change. But I think whether it's Biden or Trump, it's a mistake not to talk about victory, because the only way, if you don't talk about victory, then the other side is going to assume that it's going to win. And so whether you're a Biden people or Trump people, I think you have to imagine a future of Ukraine winning and what it would take to get there, even if all you're trying to do is deter or get Putin where you want him. If you don't have the imagination of victory, you're actually not going to get to peace.
So being the Ukrainian, the only one on the stage, but we have the general in the first row, I still want to address that, maybe to have a bit more clarity, because I think in these debates, it's often missed how we imagine the results of the settlement, just the freeze, for the rest. I would imagine my city being occupied and I'm dead, that's how I see that. But, I would imagine that the Western support is in downfall. But I can't imagine that all of a sudden the collaboration between, let's say, Beijing and Pyongyang stops and somebody monitors that, OSCE or any other institution. What would you say? What would be your explanation if you need to describe what happens if we agrees to something we don't know, but what is discussed?
For me, it's very simple question. First, today we said about the security guarantee. Security guarantee from our friends, from our partners, but return against Budapest Memorandum, some guarantee, the same. Next one, for example, in 2014, I said my friends, my partners, concerning that plans of Russian Federation. Russia wants not some part of Ukraine. Russia wants all Ukraine, all territory, all potential, military potential, defense industry potential, and people. It's wishes of the Russia. And that is why for me, it's possible after a short period of time, Russia will start another active phase of this war, unfortunately.
Hey, yeah.
You talk about ending the war, whether it's a freeze or not. For Korea's case, we ended the war. There was a truce. But whether you believe it or not, we are still at war with North Korea. The war is not over. It is still going on for the past 72 years.
But plus presence of US troops in your territory.
Right. So, but let me just explain. So at first, US came, fought, and then, left, and then, came back again, and then start, maintaining the whole presence. But my words to you is that the war is still going on right now. We didn't win the war back in 1953, but we definitely won against North Korea because now our economic size is 100 times larger than North Korea. So I think, and whether you believe it or not, over the years, US, we made the economy the way it is, that US wanted to come into Korea to build, a big military base. Korea hosts the largest American military base outside the United States, 1/4 of the New York Manhattan. And it's the closest military base to China. It takes 5 minutes to go into the space and, air and bomb Beijing if it wants to. If it will take, 2 hours from Okinawa, it takes only 5 minutes. It's the closest. So in terms of the US military generals, this is the best spot for US to defend against the Chinese aggression. But anyway, my point is that over the 70-something years, Korea just kept on evolving. And of course, with the help of US, the US security guarantee was there. So we were, more, more calm in terms of developing economic, strength and so on. But my point is that, whether it will be forced to end the war, you take from there. And I think, the next step is to, let Russia know that Ukraine becomes a powerhouse in the next 50 years or 30 years, whatever, to make sure that they can never, ever look, over the border. And in doing so, I bet you, as Professor Brian said, in the next 10, 20 years, times and the administration, Putin will die and things will change. And when that opportune moment comes, later, can absorb, have Ukraine as a member, then, you will have the security guarantee for sure. So that's just my take.
We are wrapping up, so I would ask probably to finalize with one thing you think Ukraine should be given, should be supported with, so Ukrainians will get what they feel will be good for them. We start this way.
This is very easy. European troops in Ukraine is the fundamental security guarantee that can politically feasibly happen now. So European forces in Ukraine have to be part of any detail.
I'm a hardliner on the issue of Ukraine's territorial integrity, and I think that giving the Russians even an inch of Ukrainian territory is just inviting more. So not a single inch of Ukrainian territory to be given to Russia, not a single inch.
What do you think overall? What would be good for the world if Ukraine gets?
Well, you guys are right. They are wrong. Simple as that. So just keep on going, and we will support you.
Tim?
Yeah, rather than repeating what was just said, it's really important for victory. When Europeans and Americans, North Americans, Ukraine's friends talk about victory, they're also talking about investment. Because the path forward to a South Korea involves investment. And we have to have active policies of reconstruction, which involve the central government, the regions, civil society, private enterprise, and we have to be thinking of that as integrally part of peace, because it will be. In order to deter Russia, Ukraine has to become stronger in a military sense in the long run, which also means in an economic sense in the long run. In order for Ukrainians to believe that this is peace, they have to be doing much better in their daily lives than they were doing during the war. And there's a very specific thing which the European Union is going to have to do, which is against its own interests, and that is to encourage Ukrainians to go back to Ukraine. There are millions of Ukrainians who have to go back. I mean, I'm not telling people to do their individual lives, but for the rebuilding of Ukraine, Germans and Poles and others have to stop posing about how they're doing such a lovely job with the refugees and admit that the refugees are there because it's in their own economic interest, and understand that to rebuild Ukraine, an awful lot of skilled folks are going to have to go back to Ukraine, and that's going to require an active European Union policy to make it happen. It's not going to happen on its own.
Thank you.